In the frozen waters of the Barents Sea, a quiet ship's cook was about to break a decade of carefully guarded silence. What started as routine meal preparation aboard a NATO research vessel took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a failing nuclear reactor that could kill everyone aboard. Elena Mirov wasn't your typical galley worker. For 10 years, she had spent her life hiding in plain sight as a civilian contractor, known for her perfect meals and invisible presence. But before that, she had been Lieutenant Commander Elena Mirov of the Russian Northern Fleet, a submarine systems engineer who had defected with secrets too dangerous to ever use again. When she encountered the amber warning light pulsing in the ship's hidden reactor chamber, she had no idea she was walking into a choice between maintaining her cover and saving 23 lives. Elena's decision to reveal her true expertise would lead to a crisis that would test every assumption about competence, credentials, and the courage to speak truth to power. What began as a classified Arctic mission would become a fight for survival, where the most overlooked person aboard held the only knowledge that mattered. The RV Svalbard would never be the same after discovering that sometimes the person making your meals is the same person who saves your life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The galley of the RV Svalbard hummed with the steady rhythm of a ship at work, but Elena Mirov noticed the skip. It was barely perceptible, a quarter-second flicker in the overhead lighting that made the stainless steel surfaces waver like disturbed water. She paused in her knife work, the blade hovering over a pile of diced onions, and listened to the ship's heartbeat. 23 souls aboard this vessel, cutting through the Barents Sea under gray Arctic skies that seemed to press down on the world like a heavy lid. 2 weeks into their classified NATO mission, the crew had settled into the comfortable monotony of routine operations. They studied underwater seismic activity, they said. Climate research, they told anyone who asked. Elena knew better. She had learned to read between the lines long before she learned to cook for military men. The voltage drop hit the kitchen equipment next, just a momentary dip that made the industrial mixer stutter and the refrigeration unit cycle. Elena set down her knife and moved to the control panel near the service window, her weathered fingers tracing the digital readouts. The ship's electrical system was struggling, fighting against something it wasn't designed to handle. She had seen this before, in another life, in another navy, when systems built for one purpose were forced to serve another. "Elena, you look troubled." Dr. Amira Kane appeared in the galley doorway, her dark eyes curious behind wire-rimmed glasses. The climatologist had become Elena's most frequent visitor, drawn perhaps by the cook's quiet intelligence, or simply by the need for human warmth in this metal world of military precision. "Just monitoring the equipment, Doctor," Elena replied, her accent carrying the faintest trace of something Eastern European, though she had worked hard to soften it over the years. "The electrical systems, they have their moods." Amira stepped closer, accepting the cup of tea Elena automatically prepared. It was their daily ritual, 15 minutes of conversation that felt almost normal in a world where nothing truly was. "I've been reviewing the sonar drift patterns from yesterday's survey. The acoustic displacement suggests significant underwater geological instability." Elena's hand stilled on the tea kettle. "You mean acoustic refraction through thermocline layers?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, technical and precise in a way that made Amira's eyebrows rise. Elena felt heat creep up her neck. She had spent 10 years learning to be invisible, learning to speak in kitchen measurements and supply orders instead of engineering specifications. "That's exactly right," Amira said slowly. "Most people wouldn't know that terminology." Elena busied herself with wiping down already clean surfaces. "I read technical manuals sometimes for the equipment maintenance." It wasn't entirely a lie. She did read manuals, obsessively, desperately, trying to keep the knowledge alive in her mind as she buried it deeper each day. But the truth was that she had once designed the sonar systems that created those acoustic displacement patterns, in laboratories buried beneath the Murmansk Naval Complex when she was someone else entirely. "Elena, you never—" Lieutenant Commander Blake Stanton's voice cut through the galley like a blade through butter. He filled the doorway with military authority, his uniform crisp despite the 2 weeks at sea, his pale eyes surveying the space with the kind of systematic attention that missed nothing. Dr. Kane, I trust the civilian staff isn't keeping you from your research duties. The dismissal in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Elena was civilian staff, kitchen help, someone who existed to serve meals and stay out of the way of important.
Actually, Commander, Elena was just... I'm sure Elena has her own responsibilities to attend to, Stanton interrupted, his gaze moving to Elena with a kind of polite indifference reserved for furniture. The galley operations need to maintain efficiency, especially with weather conditions deteriorating. Elena nodded, falling back into the role that had protected her for a decade. Invisible, unremarkable, safe. Of course, Commander. Dinner will be ready at 1800 hours. See that it is. Stanton's attention had already moved on, his focus shifting to Amira. Doctor, I need to review your data collection protocols. We're entering a sensitive operational area, and I want to ensure all civilian activities remain within mission parameters. Elena watched them leave, Amira casting an apologetic glance over her shoulder. When they were gone, she returned to the control panel, studying the readouts with growing unease. The electrical fluctuations weren't random. They followed a pattern that spoke of systemic stress, of infrastructure pushed beyond its design limits. Outside the small porthole above the service counter, she could see ice forming on the deck railings. The weather report called for severe conditions, an Arctic storm system that would test every system aboard this Svalbard. But storms were predictable. It was the hidden stresses that killed people. Elena moved through her afternoon routine with practiced efficiency, preparing the evening meal while her mind catalogued every electrical hiccup, every momentary voltage drop. By the time she descended to the lower storage areas to retrieve supplies, the pattern had become undeniable. The storage compartments were located 2 decks below the galley, in the ship's belly, where the hull curved inward, and the constant sound of water against steel created an almost hypnotic rhythm. Elena preferred it down here, the isolation, the honesty of the ship's basic functions. No one questioned a cook's need to check supplies. She was reaching for a case of canned vegetables when she saw it. A control panel she had never noticed before, partially hidden behind a rack of cleaning supplies. The display was dark except for a single amber warning light that pulsed with mechanical persistence. Elena moved the supplies aside and studied the panel, her heart beginning to race. She recognized the configuration. The Cyrillic lettering had been covered with English labels, but the layout was unmistakable. A Soviet-era nuclear reactor monitoring system, the kind used in submarines when reliability mattered more than elegance. The kind she had spent 5 years designing improvements for, back when her name was on classified reports and her clearance level was higher than most admirals. The amber light indicated a cooling system malfunction. Preliminary stage. Not yet critical, but trending in a direction that would become irreversible if not addressed. Elena stared at the panel, her hands trembling slightly. She had sworn an oath when they granted her asylum, never to work in military systems again, never to use the knowledge that had made her valuable enough to defect. In exchange, she would disappear into civilian life, become someone unremarkable, someone safe. But 23 people lived and worked above her head. 23 souls who had no idea that their ship carried a secret that could kill them all if the right person didn't speak up. The ship shuddered slightly as they hit rougher seas, and Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with suppressed knowledge. She had kept her silence for 10 years. She could keep it longer. Couldn't she? She memorized the panel's readings and carefully repositioned the cleaning supplies. As she gathered her materials and headed back to the galley, the amber light continued its patient warning pulse in the darkness behind her. Above deck, the first flakes of snow began to fall. The storm arrived like a living thing, clawing at the Svalbard with wind that screamed through the rigging and waves that hammered the hull with increasing violence. Elena felt it in her bones before the first weather alert sounded. The way the ship's rhythm changed, the subtle shift in how the steel moved beneath her feet. She was preparing the morning meal when the lights flickered again, longer this time. The coffee maker died mid-cycle, and the ventilation system stuttered before resuming with a labored hum. Through the galley's small porthole, she could see spray freezing instantly into sheets of ice that build layer upon layer on every exposed surface. "Communication systems are down," Ensign Tarek Almasari announced as he burst through the galley door, his young face flushed with exertion. "Temporary loss of satellite uplink. Commander Stanton wants all departments to report system status." Elena nodded, checking her equipment logs. "Galley systems operational, but experiencing voltage irregularities. Backup heating may be required if main power fluctuates further." Tarek made notes on his tablet, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He was new to Arctic operations, and the sudden isolation was getting to him. "Mom, have you noticed anything unusual about the power distribution patterns? Some of the readings I'm getting don't match the ship's technical specifications." The question was innocent, probably routine, but it made Elena's chest tighten. "Of course, the readings don't match. The Svalbard is running on hybrid systems that had never been designed to work together. Soviet-era backup power married to NATO electronics. Classified modifications hidden in plain sight." "I am only the cook," she said carefully. "But perhaps Chief Ortega could answer your questions better." "Yeah, probably." He hesitated, then leaned closer. "Between you and me, some of these energy patterns look like something from old submarine specs, like really old, Cold War stuff." Elena kept her expression neutral, but her heart raced. The boy was observant, dangerously so. "I would not know about such things." After he left, Elena stood at the galley window and watched ice accumulate on the deck. The storm was intensifying, but it wasn't the weather that worried her. It was the hidden reactor 2 decks below, struggling with coolant systems that had been designed for different operational parameters. The fire started at 13:47 hours.
Elena smelled the smoke before the alarm sounded. The acrid scent of burning insulation carried through the ventilation system. She was moving toward the emergency panel when the ship's announcement system crackled to life. "Fire in secondary galley storage. All available personnel to damage control stations." Elena grabbed the emergency kit and raced toward the source of the smoke, arriving just as Chief Petty Officer Luis Ortega emerged from the burning compartment with 2 injured crew members. Their faces were streaked with soot, their hands blistered from electrical burns. "Short circuit in the auxiliary power distribution," Ortega shouted over the alarm klaxons. "Whole panel just went up in flames." Petty Officer Yelena Sidorova appeared with a medical kit, her movements calm and efficient as she began treating the burns. Elena found herself kneeling beside her, helping to stabilize the injured crew members while Ortega's team dealt with the fire. "You have medical training?" Yelena asked, surprised by Elena's competence with first aid procedures. "Basic emergency response," Elena replied. Though the truth was more complex, Soviet naval engineering training had included extensive damage control procedures. She knew how to treat everything from radiation exposure to decompression injuries. As they worked, Elena's mind was cataloging the implications of the fire. Electrical shorts didn't happen randomly. They were symptoms of systemic overload, signs that the ship's power distribution was being pushed beyond safe parameters. The hybrid systems were failing, and if her suspicions about the hidden reactor were correct, this was just the beginning. Once the injured crew members were stabilized and the fire was extinguished, Elena made her way back through the ship's lower levels. She had memorized the layout during her 2 weeks aboard, a habit from her previous life, when knowing every exit route could mean the difference between survival and capture. The maintenance hatch was exactly where she expected it to be, hidden behind a ventilation intake in a service corridor that most crew members never used. Elena opened it carefully and found herself looking at a section of the ship's cooling system that definitely wasn't in any official documentation.
The coolant valve was ancient, Soviet-era construction with Cyrillic markings that had been painted over but not replaced. It was leaking, just slightly, leaving a trace of chemical breakdown under extreme pressure. Elena knew this type of valve intimately. She had specified identical units for submarine reactor cooling systems in her previous life. The leak was small now, but it would grow. In a few days, maybe a week, it would become critical. And if it failed completely while the ship was running on backup power? Elena closed the hatch and made her way back to her quarters, her mind racing. She needed to document what she had found, but she couldn't risk exposing her knowledge directly. Too many questions would follow. Questions about how a ship's cook knew the difference between primary and secondary cooling circuits, between normal operational stress and system failure. In her small cabin, she sat at the tiny desk and began to sketch. Her hands remembered the precision of technical drawings, the exact proportions that conveyed both information and authority. She drew the cooling system layout from memory, marking the failing valve and the cascade of problems it would create. The drawing was technically perfect, professionally rendered in a way that would convince any engineer of its accuracy. It was also completely incriminating. No civilian cook should be able to produce such detailed technical documentation. Elena stared at the drawing for a long time, weighing the risks. Revealing her knowledge might save 23 lives, but it would also destroy the identity she had carefully constructed over 10 years. Elena Mirov, the cook, would cease to exist, replaced by Elena Mirov, the defector, the security risk, the woman with a past too dangerous to ignore. Outside her porthole, the storm continued to intensify. Ice built up on the glass like bars on a prison window, and Elena realized that her choice had already been made. She sealed the drawing in an envelope and wrote a single word on the front: urgent. Dr. Amira Kane would find it in her laboratory in the morning. What happened after that was out of Elena's hands. She lay in her narrow bunk and listened to the ship groan under the storm's assault. Somewhere below, an amber warning light continued its patient pulse in the darkness. Elena found Chief Petty Officer Luis Ortega in the engine room at 06:30 a.m., 2 cups of coffee in her hands and 22 years of suppressed technical knowledge burning in her chest. The chief was studying a diagnostic tablet, his weathered face creased with the kind of frustration that came from fighting systems that made no sense. "Chief, I brought you coffee," Elena said, setting 1 cup on his workbench, "and perhaps you could help me understand something." Ortega looked up, surprised but not unwelcoming. In her experience, engineers were always happy to explain their work to anyone who showed genuine interest. "What's on your mind, Elena?" She chose her words carefully, trying to sound curious rather than knowledgeable. "The electrical problems yesterday, they seem to follow a pattern. In the galley equipment, I noticed the voltage drops always preceded the system failures by approximately 47 seconds. 47 seconds? Ortega's eyebrows rose. That's pretty specific timing. "I timed it," Elena said, pulling a small notebook from her apron pocket. "I thought it might be helpful for your diagnostics." Ortega studied her notes, his expression shifting from mild interest to sharp attention. "These readings, where did you get these measurements?" "The galley systems monitor power quality. I have been keeping track." I paused, then took the calculated risk. "Chief, I am wondering if the cooling system pressure might be affecting the electrical distribution." The silence that followed felt like walking on thin ice. One wrong step and everything would collapse. Ortega set down the tablet and looked at her with the kind of scrutiny she had been avoiding for 10 years. "Elena, you're a cook. Why would you think there's a connection between cooling systems and electrical distribution?" "Because I designed the integration protocols for hybrid submarine power systems," Elena thought. "Because I spent 5 years debugging exactly these kinds of cascade failures. Because I know that 47 seconds is the propagation delay for a failing coolant circulation pump to affect primary electrical distribution in a Soviet-era naval reactor. I read the maintenance manuals for the galley equipment. Sometimes they mention system interactions." Ortega's expression softened slightly, but remained skeptical. Look, Elena, I appreciate the observations, but cooling systems are way outside the galley's operational scope. The power fluctuations are probably just storm-related stress on the hull-mounted generators. But what if, Elena? His voice carried the patient condescension of someone explaining reality to a well-meaning amateur. You're not on the engineering team. These systems are complicated, and there are safety protocols that require qualified personnel to— Elena! Chief Ortega, is there a problem here? Lieutenant Commander Stanton's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. He stood in the engine room doorway, his pale eyes moving from Elena to Ortega with the kind of systematic attention that cataloged everything and forgot nothing. No problem, sir, Ortega replied quickly. Elena was just delivering coffee and asking some questions about the electrical issues. Stanton's gaze settled on Elena with cold precision. What kind of questions? Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the instinctive need to become invisible. But 23 lives hung in the balance, and the amber warning light in the hidden compartment continued its patient pulse. I have been noticing patterns in the power fluctuations, she said carefully. I thought the information might be useful for troubleshooting. Patterns, Stanton's voice carried a dangerous flatness. And what makes you think you're qualified to identify patterns in naval engineering systems? The question was a trap, carefully constructed to corner her between competence and credibility. Any answer that demonstrated real knowledge would raise questions about her background. Any answer that didn't would mark her as someone who wasted officers' time with uninformed speculation. I only wanted to be helpful, Elena said, falling back on the role that had protected her for 10 years. If I have overstepped? You have. Stanton's interruption was sharp, final. Chief Ortega, I trust you can handle diagnostic procedures without input from civilian personnel. Yes, sir. Elena, your responsibilities are limited to food service. I strongly suggest you focus on those duties and leave technical matters to qualified personnel. Any further interference with ship operations will result in disciplinary action. Elena nodded, her face burning with suppressed frustration. I understand, Commander. See that you do. As she left the engine room, you heard Ortega's voice behind her. Chief, the readings she mentioned were actually pretty detailed. Maybe we should— Chief, we don't have time to chase theories from the kitchen staff. Focus on proven diagnostic procedures. Elena made it back to the galley before the anger hit her, a white-hot surge of fury at a system that valued credentials over competence, that would rather risk lives than admit that knowledge could come from unexpected sources. She had spent 10 years learning to swallow that anger, to accept invisibility as the price of safety. But the amber light was still pulsing, and the cooling system was still failing, and 23 people were still going to die if someone didn't act. Dr. Amira Kane found her an hour later, standing at the galley window and staring out at the storm. The climatologist's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Elena, I found your envelope. Elena's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. What envelope? Amira pulled out the technical drawing, holding it like something dangerous. This envelope, with the cooling system schematic. She spread the paper on the steel counter, her finger tracing the precise lines and technical annotations. Elena, this matches the ship's actual configuration exactly, down to specifications that aren't in any documentation I have access to. Elena said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she wiped down an already clean surface. More than that, Amira continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Some of these technical details, they're not in English naval standards. The valve specifications, the pressure ratings, they're based on Soviet engineering protocols. The words hung in the air between them like unexploded ordnance. Elena could lie, could claim she copied the drawing from some manual, could maintain the fiction that had protected her for 10 years. Or she could trust the one person aboard the Svalbard who had shown her genuine respect. Dr. Kane, Elena said quietly, what do you know about Soviet submarine cooling systems? Amira's eyes widened. Only what I've read in technical papers, but Elena, why would you— She stopped, studying Elena's face with growing understanding. Who are you? Elena was quiet for a long moment, weighing risks and possibilities. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper.
I used to be someone different. Someone who knew these systems very well. She gestured toward the drawing. "That cooling valve will fail within the week. When it does, the backup reactor will lose primary coolant circulation. The automated safety protocols will try to compensate, but they're calibrated for different operational parameters." "Backup reactor?" Amira's voice was sharp with alarm. "Elena, what backup reactor?" "The one that is not in any of your documentation. The one that is keeping the ship's life support systems operational, while we are cut off from outside support." Elena met Amira's eyes. "The one that will cause a containment breach if that valve fails." Amira stared at the drawing, her scientific mind processing implications. "How do you know this?" "Because I designed similar systems, in a different life, for a different navy." Elena's voice carried the weight of 10 years of silence. "Dr. Kane, I need you to help me convince someone in authority to listen, because I cannot do it alone. They have made that very clear." Amira was quiet for a moment, then folded the drawing carefully. "Elena, if what you're saying is true, then we need to act immediately. But first, I need to understand exactly who you used to be." Elena nodded, feeling a decade of carefully constructed identity beginning to crumble. "That is a very long story." "Then we'd better find somewhere private to talk," Amira said. "And Elena, we're going to need help. Someone who can investigate your background discreetly." Elena thought of Midshipman Rena D'Souza, the young officer who had shown such kind interest in everyone's stories. "I may know someone." Outside the galley window, the storm continued its assault on the Svalbard. But Elena felt something shifting inside the ship's steel hull. The first cracks in the wall of silence she had built around herself. The amber light pulsed on in the darkness, patient and persistent, counting down to a crisis that would demand the truth from everyone aboard. Midshipman Rena D'Souza had always been fascinated by people's stories, but Elena Mirov's tale was becoming something far more complex than the usual shipboard biography. It started innocently enough, a chance encounter in the mess hall where she overheard Elena muttering something under her breath while reviewing supply lists. The words were Russian. She was certain of it. Her grandmother had fled Ukraine decades ago, carrying enough of the old language that she recognized the cadence, the particular way consonants clustered together like stones in running water. But Elena was supposed to be Estonian, according to her personnel file, a civilian contractor who had spent most of her adult life cooking for NATO vessels. Her curiosity might have ended there, filed away as one of those small mysteries that made shipboard life interesting. But then Dr. Kane had approached her with an unusual request. "Rena, I need you to help me with something sensitive," Amira had said, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that meant classified business. "I need you to look into Elena's background, discreetly." "What kind of background check, ma'am?" "The kind that goes deeper than personnel files. Service records, technical qualifications, anything that might explain why she knows things she shouldn't know." Now, 3 days later, Rena sat in her cramped quarters with a tablet full of crypted naval databases and a growing sense that Elena Mirov was not who she claimed to be. The search had started with routine queries, employment history, citizenship verification, standard civilian contractor protocols. But inconsistencies had emerged like cracks in ice under pressure. The Estonian documentation was perfect, too perfect. The kind of thorough, seamless backstory that intelligence services created for people who needed new identities. And buried deep in a classified NATO defector database, accessible only through Rena's junior intelligence clearance, was a name that made her breath catch. Elena Mirov, former Lieutenant Commander, Russian Northern Fleet, submarine systems engineering specialist, defected during the Murmansk Conference 2015. Current status? Classified. Rena stared at the screen, her mind racing. The woman who made our meals, who smiled quietly and kept to herself,
who knew exactly how Chief Ortega liked his coffee. That woman once designed weapon systems for the Russian Navy. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Dr. Kane entered, her face tense with worry. "Have you found anything?" "More than I expected," Rena said, turning the tablet toward Amira. "Dr. Kane, Elena isn't just a cook. She's a defector, a high-level submarine engineer who came over to our side 10 years ago." Amira studied the classified file, her scientific mind processing implications. "This explains everything. The technical drawings, the system knowledge." She looked up at Rena. "But it also means she's been hiding this for a decade. Why would she risk exposure now?" "Because something's wrong. Really wrong. I've been monitoring the ship's energy patterns like Ensign Al-Masri asked me to, and the readings are getting worse. Whatever Elena is worried about, it's accelerating." As if summoned by their conversation, Tarek appeared in the doorway, his tablet clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Ma'am, I need to report something. The energy spikes from the auxiliary
Systems, they're not random anymore. They're following a specific pattern, and it's pointing towards something that shouldn't exist on this ship." "What kind of something?" Amira asked. "A nuclear reactor, a small one, probably backup power, but it's running hot, way too hot." Tarek's voice cracked slightly. "Ma'am, according to these readings, we're sitting on top of a reactor that's heading toward critical mass." Rena felt ice form in her stomach. "How long do we have?" "If the pattern holds, maybe 48 hours before automated safety protocols kick in. But those protocols," Tarek shook his head, "they're Soviet-era programming. If they engage while we're in emergency power mode, they could trigger a complete system lockdown." Amira stood abruptly. "We need to find Elena, now." They found her in the galley, methodically cleaning equipment that was already spotless. Her movements had the precise, controlled rhythm of someone fighting to maintain composure. And when she looked up at their approach, Rena saw fear in her eyes. "Elena," Amira said gently, "we need to talk." "About what, Dr. Kane?" "About Lieutenant Commander Elena Mirov of the Russian Northern Fleet." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the ship's mechanical heartbeat and the distant sound of wind against steel. Elena's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, resignation, and finally a kind of exhausted relief. "How much do you know?" Elena asked quietly. "Enough to understand why you've been so worried about the ship's systems." "Elena, we know about the reactor. We know it's becoming unstable, and we know that you're probably the only person aboard who understands how to fix it." Elena sank onto a steel stool, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I promised them I would never work on military systems again. It was the condition of my asylum, that I would disappear, become invisible, never use the knowledge that made me dangerous." "But people are going to die if you don't act," Rena said, her young voice filled with desperate certainty. "People are going to die if I do act," Elena replied. "When NATO command learns that I broke my agreement, when they discover that a Russian defector has been working on classified vessels for 10 years, she shook her head, "they will assume I am a spy. They will assume this crisis was sabotage." Tarek stepped forward, his tablet extended. "Ma'am, look at these readings. The reactor isn't just becoming unstable, it's entering a feedback loop. In approximately 6 hours, the backup systems will attempt an emergency shutdown, but the cooling circuits are compromised, and if the shutdown protocols engage while coolant circulation is reduced." Elena took the tablet, her eyes scanning the data with the fluid competence of someone reading her native language. "The thermal shock will crack the containment vessel," she finished. "Radiation leak, possible steam explosion, total loss of life support systems." "Can you stop it?" Amira asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying the readings with growing alarm. "The automated protocols can be overwritten, but only from the reactor control station. And that station," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "requires clearance codes that only senior engineering officers possess."
What about manual override? Rena asked. Possible, but dangerous. Someone would need to access the reactor chamber directly, reconfigure the cooling circuits, and reset the safety protocols from inside the containment area. Elena looked up from the tablet, her face pale. It would require someone who understood Soviet reactor design intimately. Before anyone could respond, the ship's announcement system crackled to life. All department heads to the bridge immediately. Priority 1 briefing. Elena stood slowly, her decision already made. Dr. Kane, you must convince Captain Volkov to listen. Tell him what you know about my background. Show him the technical data. Make him understand that this is not sabotage. It is a design flaw in a hybrid system that was never meant to operate under these conditions. What about you? Amira asked. I will prepare for what comes next, Elena said, her voice carrying a strange calm. If the captain allows it, I will go into that reactor chamber and save this ship. If he does not, then we all die together in the Arctic. As they left the galley, Rena caught Elena's arm. Ma'am, why did you defect? Why did you give up everything to come to our side? Elena smiled sadly. Because I believed that knowledge should serve life, not death. 10 years ago, I thought I could make that choice and never look back. She glanced toward the ship's lower decks, where an amber warning light continued its patient pulse. It seems the choice has found me again. The bridge of the RV Svalbard felt like a tomb when Captain Hendrik Volkov delivered the news. External communications were completely severed. Not temporarily down, but physically severed by ice damage to the primary antenna array. The storm had driven them into an ice field where conventional rescue would be impossible for at least a week. We are effectively alone, Volkov announced to the assembled department heads, his Norwegian accent thick with tension. Emergency power protocols are now in effect. All non-essential systems offline. Survival takes priority over mission objectives. Elena stood at the back of the briefing room, officially invisible, but tolerated because Dr. Kane had insisted on her presence. Lieutenant Commander Stanton's pale eyes kept finding her, questions and suspicion written in his expression. Sir, Chief Ortega spoke up. The power distribution problems are getting worse. We've had 3 more electrical fires in the past 6 hours, and I'm seeing system interactions that don't match our technical documentation. Explain, Volkov ordered. Ortega glanced nervously at Elena before continuing. Some of the ship's backup systems appear to be non-standard. Soviet-era components integrated with NATO electronics. The power loads don't balance correctly, and there are safety protocols running that I can't identify or override. Dr. Kane stepped forward. Captain, I need to brief you on a critical discovery regarding our current situation.
Volkov's expression hardened. Doctor, unless this relates directly to immediate survival? It does. Amira's voice cut through his objection with scientific authority. Sir, this ship is carrying an undisclosed nuclear reactor. It's currently experiencing a cascade failure that will result in containment breach within hours unless immediate action is taken. The silence that followed was electric. Stanton's face went white, Ortega cursed under his breath, and Volkov's carefully controlled composure cracked like ice under pressure. That is impossible, the captain said flatly. This vessel carries no nuclear materials. The technical specifications are incomplete, Amira interrupted. Captain, I have documented proof of Soviet-era reactor components integrated into this ship's power systems, and I have identified the only person aboard who possesses the expertise to address the crisis. All eyes turned to Elena, who stepped forward with the careful dignity of someone walking to their own execution. Captain Volkov, my name is Elena Mirov. I am a former Lieutenant Commander in the Northern Fleet Submarine Systems Engineering Division. 10 years ago, I defected to NATO during the Murmansk Conference. I have been living under protected status as a civilian contractor.
The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Volkov's face cycled through shock, rage, and calculation before settling into cold military precision. You are telling me that a Russian naval officer has been operating aboard NATO vessels for 10 years without proper security clearance? I had clearance, Elena replied, but only for civilian duties. My technical background was classified, and I was forbidden from working on military systems. Yet here you stand, claiming to understand systems that our own engineers cannot diagnose. Because I designed similar systems. The reactor currently threatening the ship is based on specifications I helped develop for Arctic submarine operations. The cooling circuits, the safety protocols, the integration with hybrid power systems. I understand them because I created them. Stanton finally found his voice. Captain, this is obviously a security breach of the highest order. This woman should be confined immediately pending investigation. Lieutenant Commander, Volkov said coldly, I am more concerned with immediate survival than with security protocols. He turned back to Elena. Miss Mirov, assuming your claims are accurate, what is our current situation? Elena pulled out the tablet Tarek had given her, displaying the energy readings. The backup reactor is experiencing thermal runaway in the primary cooling circuit. In approximately 4 hours, automated safety protocols will attempt an emergency shutdown, but the cooling system has been compromised by pressure stress. When the shutdown occurs, thermal shock will crack the containment vessel. Radiation leak? Volkov asked. Among other things, loss of life support, potential steam explosion, and certainly the death of everyone aboard. Ortega leaned forward, studying the data. Can the automatic shutdown be prevented? Yes, but only through manual override of the reactor control systems. Someone must enter the reactor chamber and reset the protocols from inside the containment area. How dangerous? Volkov demanded. Elena was quiet for a moment. Significant radiation exposure. Possible death if the override procedure takes too long or if complications arise. And you're volunteering for this. I am the only person aboard who understands the specific procedures required. Stanton slammed his hand on the briefing table. Captain, this is obviously a security breach of the highest order. This woman should be confined immediately pending investigation. Lieutenant Commander, Volkov said coldly, I am more concerned with immediate survival than with security protocols. He turned back to Elena. Miss Mirov, assuming I authorize this procedure, what are the chances of success? If the override is performed correctly and the cooling system responds as designed, approximately 70%. And if we do nothing? 0% survival. Volkov nodded slowly. Very well. Chief Ortega, prepare. Sir, Stanton interrupted, I cannot recommend this course of action. The security implications alone. Lieutenant Stanton, Volkov said coldly, you are welcome to file whatever reports you consider necessary after we survive. He turned back to Elena. Miss Mirov, you will proceed with the override procedure under Chief Ortega's supervision. However, I am placing you under technical arrest pending resolution of this crisis. Elena nodded. I understand, Captain.
You will be confined to quarters except when performing essential duties. Any deviation from authorized activities will result in immediate detention. As the briefing broke up, Elena found herself escorted to her small cabin by 2 armed crew members. Through her porthole, she could see the storm continuing its assault on the ship, ice building layer upon layer on every surface. But it wasn't the weather that worried her anymore. Somewhere below, an amber warning light was about to turn red, and time was running out for all of them. Elena's quarters felt like a prison cell, despite the unlocked door and the polite guards stationed outside. She sat on her narrow bunk, listening to the ship's increasingly erratic heartbeat, and knowing that every moment of delay brought them closer to disaster. The reactor was dying, and she was the only one who could save it. Through her cabin's thin walls, she could hear Chief Ortega and Lieutenant Commander Stanton in the corridor, their voices raised in urgent consultation. "The manual override isn't working," Ortega was saying, frustration clear in his tone. "Every time we try to access the control protocols, the system locks us out with Soviet-era security codes." "Try bypassing the authentication," Stanton ordered. "I already did. The safety systems are hardwired. They won't accept commands without proper clearance codes. And those codes," Ortega paused, "they're in Russian, sir. Military-grade encryption that I've never seen before." Elena closed her eyes, visualizing the control interface she had designed years ago. The security protocols had been her innovation, a way to prevent unauthorized access to critical systems while allowing emergency override by qualified personnel. She had never imagined those same protocols would one day trap her on the wrong side of a crisis. "Sir," I heard Tarek's voice join the conversation. "The reactor temperature is approaching red line. If we can't reset the cooling parameters in the next hour—" "I'm aware of the timeline, Ensign," Stanton snapped. "Chief, try accessing the manual controls from the auxiliary station." "I already tried that too, sir. The whole system is integrated. You can't override one component without affecting the others. It's like trying to perform surgery with boxing gloves." Elena stood up and moved to her cabin door. The guards looked at her with polite wariness but didn't stop her from listening to the conversation. "Sir," Ortega continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "maybe we should reconsider Captain Volkov's authorization. Elena, Ms. Mirov, she might be the only one who can make this work." "Absolutely not," Stanton replied. "I don't care what her technical background is, she's a security risk. For all we know, this whole crisis is exactly what she planned." Elena's hands tightened into fists. 10 years of careful invisibility, 10 years of proving her loyalty through quiet service, and still they saw her as a threat rather than salvation. "Commander," Ortega said carefully, "with respect, sir, I've been working with ship systems for 22 years. I know the difference between sabotage and design failure. This reactor wasn't built to operate under these conditions. It's a jury-rigged system that's finally breaking down under stress. Then we fix it without compromising ship security. Sir, we've been trying for 4 hours. The system won't respond to anything we do." Through her porthole, Elena could see ice forming patterns on the glass like fractal prison bars. The storm was worsening, and soon it wouldn't matter whether the reactor failed or not. The Arctic would claim them all. She was still watching the ice when she heard footsteps in the corridor, followed by Dr. Kane's voice. "Chief Ortega, I need to speak with you about Elena's technical drawings." Elena moved closer to the door, straining to hear the conversation. "What about them, ma'am?" "I've been studying the schematic she provided. The level of detail, the technical specifications. This isn't something someone could copy from a manual. The valve tolerances, the pressure calculations, the integration protocols." Amira paused. "Chief, whoever drew this diagram designed the original system." Elena heard Ortega's sharp intake of breath. "You're saying she actually built this thing?" "I'm saying she knows this reactor better than anyone else possibly could. And right now, that knowledge is locked behind a door while we're running out of time." Silence followed, broken only by the ship's groaning protests against the storm. Elena could almost hear Ortega's mental calculations, weighing regulations against reality, protocol against survival. "Ma'am," Ortega said, finally, "if I were to, hypothetically, allow Elena access to the reactor controls, would that be considered mutiny?" "I'm not a military officer, Chief. I can't answer questions about military law. But I can tell you that we have approximately 40 minutes before automated shutdown protocols engage, and another 20 minutes after that before containment failure becomes irreversible. And if the containment fails, everyone dies." Elena heard footsteps approaching her door, followed by Dr. Kane's voice. "Chief Ortega, I need to speak with you about Elena's technical drawings. What about them, ma'am? I've been studying the schematic she provided, the level of detail, the technical specifications. This isn't something someone could copy from a manual. The valve tolerances, the pressure calculations, the integration protocols. Amira paused. Chief, whoever drew this diagram designed the original system. Elena heard Ortega's sharp intake of breath. You're saying she actually built this thing? I'm saying she knows this reactor better than anyone else possibly could. And right now, that knowledge is locked behind a door while we're running out of time. Silence followed, broken only by the ship's groaning protests against the storm. Elena could almost hear Ortega's mental calculations, weighing regulations against reality, protocol against survival. Ma'am, Ortega said carefully, if I were to hypothetically allow Elena access to the reactor controls, would that be considered mutiny? I'm not a military officer, Chief. I can't answer questions about military law, but I can tell you that we have approximately 40 minutes before automated shutdown protocols engage, and another 20 minutes after that before containment failure becomes irreversible. And if the containment fails, everyone dies. Elena heard footsteps approaching her door, followed by Dr. Kane's voice. Chief Ortega, I need to speak with you about Elena's technical drawings. What about them, ma'am? I've been studying the schematic she provided, the level of detail, the technical specifications. This isn't something someone could copy from a manual. The valve tolerances, the pressure calculations, the integration protocols. Amira paused. Chief, whoever drew this diagram designed the original system. Elena heard Ortega's sharp intake of breath. You're saying she actually built this thing? I'm saying she knows this reactor better than anyone else possibly could, and right now, that knowledge is locked behind a door while we're running out of time. Silence followed, broken only by the ship's groaning protests against the storm. Elena could almost hear Ortega's mental calculations, weighing regulations against reality, protocol against survival. Ma'am, Ortega said carefully, if I were to hypothetically allow Elena access to the reactor controls, would that be considered mutiny? I'm not a military officer, Chief. I can't answer questions about military law, but I can tell you that we have approximately 40 minutes before automated shutdown protocols engage, and another 20 minutes after that before containment failure becomes irreversible. And if the containment fails, everyone dies. Elena heard footsteps approaching her door, followed by Dr. Kane's voice. Chief Ortega, I need to speak with you about Elena's technical drawings. What about them, ma'am? I've been studying the schematic she provided, the level of detail, the technical specifications. This isn't something someone could copy from a manual. The valve tolerances, the pressure calculations, the integration protocols. Amira paused. Chief, whoever drew this diagram designed the original system. Elena heard Ortega's sharp intake of breath. You're saying she actually built this thing? I'm saying she knows this reactor better than anyone else possibly could, and right now, that knowledge is locked behind a door while we're running out of time. Silence followed, broken only by the ship's groaning protests against the storm. Elena could almost hear Ortega's mental calculations, weighing regulations against reality, protocol against survival. Ma'am, Ortega said carefully, if I were to hypothetically allow Elena access to the reactor controls, would that be considered mutiny? I'm not a military officer, Chief. I can't answer questions about military law, but I can tell you that we have approximately 40 minutes before automated shutdown protocols engage, and another 20 minutes after that before containment failure becomes irreversible. And if the containment fails, everyone dies. Elena heard footsteps approaching her door, followed by Dr. Kane's voice. Chief Ortega, I need to speak with you about Elena's Behind them, Lieutenant Commander Stanton followed with the grim determination of a man watching his career die. But Elena no longer cared about careers or protocols or the careful fiction she had maintained for 10 years. The amber warning light was about to turn red, and Elena Mirov was finally going home. The reactor chamber existed in a world of perpetual twilight, lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of amber and red. Elena descended the maintenance ladder with the careful precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, though never under these circumstances. Above her, Chief Ortega's voice crackled through the communication system. "Elena, the control panel is showing reactor temperature at 96% of critical mass. You've got maybe 15 minutes before the automated systems lock down completely." Elena studied the control interface, her hands moving over displays that felt like conversations with old friends. The system was exactly as she remembered, elegant in its simplicity, ruthless in its efficiency, and currently heading toward catastrophic failure. "Chief, I need you to locate a bypass valve approximately 3 meters aft of your position. It should be marked with Cyrillic characters, small yellow handle." "Found it. What do you need me to do?" "When I give the command, turn it counterclockwise exactly 2.5 turns. No more, no less. If you turn it too far, you will flood the chamber I am in." Elena heard Ortega's sharp intake of breath through the comm system. She didn't mention that if she miscalculated the pressure differential, the chamber would flood anyway, or that the radiation levels in her current location were already approaching dangerous levels. The primary cooling circuit was easier to access than she had expected. Whoever had modified the original Soviet design had maintained the maintenance protocols she had written. Elena removed the access panel and found herself staring at a maze of pipes and valves that told the story of the reactor's slow decline. "Dr. Kane, are you monitoring the pressure readings?" "Yes, Elena. Primary circuit is showing critical stress fractures. The valve you identified is leaking coolant faster than predicted." Elena nodded, though no one could see her. The situation was worse than her initial assessment, but still manageable if she worked quickly. She began the delicate process of rerouting coolant flow through auxiliary circuits, her hands moving with muscle memory that spanned 2 decades. "Chief, initiate bypass valve procedure. 2.5 turns counterclockwise, starting now." The sound of rushing coolant filled the chamber as Elena worked to balance pressure across multiple circuits simultaneously. This was the art of reactor engineering, not just understanding the individual components, but feeling the system's rhythm, knowing when to push and when to wait. "Elena," Lieutenant Commander Stanton's voice cut through the comm chatter. "Elena, what's your status down there?" Elena paused in her work, surprised to hear from the man who had been her strongest opponent. "Proceeding with pressure rebalancing, Commander. Estimated completion in 8 minutes. "Understood." "Elena," Stanton's voice carried something she had never heard from him before. "Respect. For what it's worth, I was wrong about you." Elena smiled grimly as she continued her work. "Thank you, Commander, but let us survive this first before we discuss apologies." The critical moment came during the final pressure rebalancing procedure. Elena had to manually override 3 separate safety protocols while maintaining coolant flow through circuits that were already operating beyond their design limits. One mistake would trigger an immediate shutdown that would crack the containment vessel. Another mistake would flood the chamber with superheated coolant. "Elena," Dr. Kane's voice was tight with concern. "The reactor temperature just spiked to 98%. You need to finish the procedure now."
Elena's hands moved across the control interface with surgical precision, entering command codes she had memorized 20 years ago. The reactor responded like a living thing, its mechanical heartbeat shifting from erratic gasping to steady rhythm. "Coolant flow reestablished," she announced, watching pressure readings stabilize across all circuits. "Safety protocols reset to manual control, reactor temperature declining." The cheer that came through the comm system was so loud Elena had to pull off her headset. She leaned against the control panel, suddenly aware of how much the effort had cost her. Her hands were shaking, her vision was blurred from radiation exposure, and she could taste metal in her mouth. "Chief, I need immediate extraction, radiation exposure protocols." "Already on my way down," Ortega replied. "Elena, you did it. The reactor is stable." But Elena was no longer listening. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis was fading, replaced by the inevitable crash that came with significant radiation exposure. She managed to initiate the emergency decontamination sequence before her legs gave out entirely. When Chief Ortega reached her, Elena was unconscious on the chamber floor, but the reactor hummed with the steady rhythm of stable operation. "Medical team to reactor level," Ortega called through his comm. "Priority 1 casualty, radiation exposure." As they carried her to the medical bay, Elena drifted in and out of consciousness. She heard fragments of conversation, Petty Officer Sidorova discussing treatment protocols, Dr. Kane demanding updates on her condition, even Captain Volkov's voice expressing concern for her recovery. But the voice that stayed with her was Lieutenant Commander Stanton's, speaking quietly to someone in the corridor outside medical. "She saved us all," he was saying. "Every single one of us. And I almost stopped her, because I was too proud to admit that a cook might know more than I did." Elena smiled grimly as the medical drugs took effect. The amber warning light in the hidden compartment was finally dark, and for the first time in 10 years, she felt like Elena Mirov again. Not just the cook, but the engineer, the defector, the woman who had chosen to serve life over death.
Through the medical bay's small porthole, she could see the storm beginning to abate. The Arctic was releasing its grip on the Svalbard, but Elena knew that another kind of storm was just beginning. Captain Volkov's encrypted communication panel was already flashing with incoming messages from NATO command, and soon the outside world would learn what had happened aboard the research vessel in the Barents Sea. Elena closed her eyes and prepared for whatever judgment awaited her. She had kept her silence for 10 years, but silence was no longer an option. The truth was about to set her free. The NATO icebreaker Resolute appeared on the horizon 3 days later, cutting through the Arctic ice like a blade through crystal. Elena watched its approach from the medical bay porthole, her body still weak from radiation exposure, but her mind sharp with the knowledge that her decade of silence was about to end. "The cavalry arrives," Petty Officer Yelena Sidorova commented, checking Elena's IV line. "Your radiation levels are stabilizing nicely. Another day or two and you'll be fit for whatever comes next." Elena smiled weakly. "I suspect what comes next will not require physical fitness." Dr. Amira Kane and Midshipman Rena D'Souza had maintained a constant vigil at Elena's bedside, and both women looked up as Captain Volkov entered the medical bay. His face bore the haggard expression of a man who had spent 3 sleepless days trying to craft a report that would explain the impossible. "Ms. Mirov," Volkov said formally, "I need to inform you that NATO command has been notified of our situation. A review board will convene aboard the Resolute to investigate the events of the past week." Elena nodded. "I understand, Captain. And what have you told them about my involvement?"
Volkov was quiet for a moment, his Norwegian reserve warring with something deeper. I have told them the truth, that you saved 23 lives through technical expertise that exceeded anything available from my regular crew. And about my background? That will be addressed by the review board. Volkov paused, then continued in a lower voice. Elena, for what it's worth, I believe you acted with honor. Whatever your past, your actions aboard my ship were those of a hero. After the captain left, Lieutenant Commander Stanton appeared in the doorway, his usual military bearing tempered by something Elena had never seen from him before: humility. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked. Amira and Rena excused themselves, leaving Elena alone with the man who had been her strongest opponent. Stanton moved to the chair beside her bed, his pale eyes troubled. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "And more than that, I owe you my life, all of our lives." Elena studied his face, seeing genuine remorse beneath the military discipline. "Commander, you were following protocol. I cannot fault you for that." "No, it was more than protocol." Stanton's voice carried the weight of hard-won self-knowledge. "I saw competence in someone who didn't fit my expectations, and I chose to dismiss it rather than challenge my assumptions. That kind of institutional blindness, it almost killed us all." "But it did not," Elena pointed out, "and now perhaps the institution can learn." Stanton was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. "Elena, when the review board convenes, I want you to know that I'll be testifying on your behalf. What you did, saving this ship, risking your life for people who had shown you nothing but suspicion, that's the kind of courage that makes the difference between good officers and great ones." Through the porthole, Elena could see crew members from the Resolute boarding the Svalbard. Official uniforms, encrypted communication equipment, the machinery of military investigation grinding into motion. "Commander," she said quietly, "whatever happens in that hearing, I want you to remember that expertise can come from unexpected places. The next time someone wearing the wrong uniform tries to save your life, listen to them." After Stanton left, Chief Ortega appeared with a tablet in his hands. The gruff engineer looked uncomfortable in the medical bay's sterile environment, but his message was clear. "Elena, I've written a formal recommendation to NATO Engineering Command. Details your technical contributions, your understanding of hybrid reactor systems, your actions during the crisis." He set the tablet on Elena's bedside table. Figured they should hear from someone who actually knows the difference between good engineering and bureaucratic nonsense. "Chief, that could affect your career." "My career will be fine," Ortega interrupted. "It's the right thing to do, and sometimes that's all that matters." As evening approached, Rena returned to sit with Elena. The young midshipman's face was thoughtful, older somehow than it had been a week ago. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked. "About silence," Rena replied. "About how many people stay quiet when they should speak up, how many voices get lost because they don't match what people expect to hear." Elena reached out and took Rena's hand. "Then do not let that happen to you. Do not let silence be your legacy. When you see something that needs to be said, say it. When you see expertise being dismissed because it comes from the wrong person, fight for it to be heard."
Like you did? Like I should have done 10 years ago, instead of hiding behind someone else's expectations of who I should be. Through the night, encrypted messages flowed between the Svalbard and NATO command. Elena could only imagine the debates raging in distant conference rooms, questions of security, precedent, the balance between institutional protocol and individual heroism. But as dawn broke over the Arctic ice, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in a decade: the peace that came with living openly,
with being seen for who she truly was rather than who she pretended to be. The review board would decide her fate, but Elena Mirov was no longer hiding. The conference room aboard the Resolute felt like a courtroom, complete with the formal arrangements of military justice. Elena sat at a simple table, facing a panel of 5 senior officers, her hands steady despite the weight of their scrutiny. Behind her, the crew of the Svalbard had assembled as witnesses, some supportive, others uncertain, all aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Admiral Sarah Chen, the review board's senior officer, opened the proceedings with crisp formality. This tribunal convenes to investigate the events aboard the research vessel Svalbard during the period of 15 to 18 November, with particular attention to the conduct of Elena Mirov, civilian contractor and former Lieutenant Commander, Russian Northern Fleet. Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest as her true identity was spoken aloud in an official forum for the first time in 10 years. But instead of the shame she had expected, she felt only relief. Ms. Mirov, Admiral Chen continued, "You stand accused of violating the terms of your asylum agreement by engaging in military engineering activities. How do you plead?" Elena stood, her voice clear and steady. "Admiral, I plead that I acted to save 23 lives, using expertise that no one else aboard possessed. If that constitutes a violation of my agreement, then I accept full responsibility for my actions." The questioning that followed was thorough and relentless. Elena answered each inquiry with technical precision, explaining the reactor crisis, her decision-making process, and the specific knowledge that had enabled her to prevent catastrophe. Lieutenant Commander Stanton was the first witness to call to testify. "In your assessment, Commander, was Ms. Mirov's intervention necessary?" Admiral Chen asked. "Absolutely, ma'am. Without her expertise, the reactor would have failed catastrophically. Every person aboard would have died." Stanton paused, then continued with visible emotion. "Admiral, I initially opposed Ms. Mirov's involvement based on security concerns. I was wrong. Her actions demonstrated the highest levels of professional competence and personal courage." Chief Ortega's testimony was equally emphatic. "Ma'am, in 22 years of naval engineering, I've never seen anyone with Elena's understanding of hybrid reactor systems. She didn't just fix our problem, she understood it better than the people who built it." Dr. Kane provided scientific analysis that supported Elena's technical claims, while Ensign Al-Masri described the energy readings that had confirmed the crisis. Even Captain Volkov, despite his obvious discomfort with the security implications, testified to Elena's heroism. But it was Midshipman D'Souza's testimony that provided the emotional heart of the proceedings. "Ma'am," Rena said, facing the review board with youthful conviction, "Elena Mirov taught me that competence and courage can exist in unexpected places. She showed me that sometimes the person making your meals is the same person who saves your life. If we're going to punish people for heroism just because they don't fit our expectations, then we're not the military I want to serve." The review board deliberated for 2 hours while Elena waited in a side compartment, staring out at the Arctic landscape and wondering if she would be facing it as a free woman or a prisoner. When they recalled her, Admiral Chen's expression was unreadable. "Miss Mirov, this board finds that while you technically violated the terms of your asylum agreement, your actions were motivated by immediate necessity and resulted in the preservation of NATO personnel and equipment. Furthermore, your decade of faithful service as a civilian contractor demonstrates your commitment to your adopted allegiance." Elena held her breath. "Therefore, this board recommends that all charges be dismissed, that your identity restriction be lifted, and that your actions be formally recognized for their heroism and technical excellence."
The silence that followed lasted only a moment before it was broken by spontaneous applause from the Svalbard crew. Elena felt tears she hadn't known were coming. 10 years of hidden identity finally dissolving into something approaching freedom. Additionally, Admiral Chen continued, "This board recommends that you be offered a position as a senior systems consultant with NATO Arctic operations, should you choose to accept it." Elena stood slowly, feeling the weight of a decade lifting from her shoulders. "Admiral, I accept with honor." As the tribunal concluded, Elena found herself surrounded by her crewmates, no longer the invisible cook, but Elena Mirov, engineer and hero. Lieutenant Commander Stanton was the first to shake her hand, followed by Chief Ortega, Dr. Kane, and finally Rena, whose eyes shone with pride.
Captain Volkov approached last, his expression complex. "Elena, I have submitted my resignation from command. The security failures that led to this crisis occurred under my watch, and I accept responsibility for them." "Captain—" "No," Volkov interrupted. "You showed me what real leadership looks like. It's time for me to step aside for someone who understands that competence matters more than credentials." As the tribunal participants dispersed, Elena stood at the Resolute's observation deck and looked out at the endless Arctic horizon. For the first time in 10 years, she felt complete, not just Elena the cook or Elena the engineer, but Elena the whole person, acknowledged and accepted for everything she was. 6 weeks later, Elena stood on the bridge of the RV Svalbard wearing the civilian uniform of a NATO systems consultant, watching ice-covered waters part before the ship's reinforced bow. The vessel looked the same, but everything else had changed. The reactor now ran smoothly under her redesigned protocols. The hybrid power systems had been upgraded with proper integration safeguards. Most importantly, the crew looked at her with the respect earned through shared crisis, rather than the polite indifference reserved for support staff. "Ma'am," Midshipman D'Souza, recently promoted to lieutenant, approached with a tablet full of diagnostic reports. "All systems showing green across the board. The modifications you designed are performing exactly as predicted." Elena smiled, reviewing data that told the story of a ship transformed. "Excellent work, Lieutenant. Your understanding of the power distribution protocols has become quite sophisticated." Rena beamed at the praise. In the weeks since the crisis, she had thrown herself into engineering studies with the passion of someone who had seen expertise triumph over prejudice. "I had an excellent teacher." Lieutenant Commander Stanton, now the Svalbard's commanding officer, joined them at the navigation station. His transformation from rigid bureaucrat to thoughtful leader had been as dramatic as Elena's emergence from invisibility. "Elena, I've received confirmation from Arctic Command. Your consulting contract has been extended for another 2 years, with authority to modify any NATO vessel operating in polar regions." He paused, then added with genuine warmth, "Welcome to your new career." Elena looked around the bridge, seeing faces that had become familiar through crisis and resolution. Chief Ortega was at his engineering station, completely at ease with the reactor systems he now understood properly. Dr. Kane was reviewing climate data that would be enhanced by the ship's improved stability. Even Ensign Al-Masri seemed more confident, his communication protocol strengthened by the knowledge that competence would be recognized regardless of rank. "Commander," Elena said, "I have a recommendation for our next mission protocol." "I'm listening." "Include civilian expertise reviews for all critical systems, not as a replacement for military knowledge, but as a complement to it. Sometimes the person who cleans the equipment understands its problems better than the person who designed it." Stanton nodded thoughtfully. "I'll draft the proposal this afternoon." As the day wore on, Elena found herself drawn to the observation deck where she had spent so many quiet hours as the ship's cook. The Arctic landscape remained unchanged, vast, beautiful, and unforgiving, but her relationship to it had been transformed. She was no longer hiding among the ice and steel. She was Elena Mirov, systems consultant, former submarine engineer, defector who had chosen the right side. Her knowledge was valued, her expertise recognized, her voice heard in councils where decisions were made. Lieutenant de Souza found her there as the sun set over the Barents Sea, painting the ice fields in shades of gold and amber. "Ma'am, what are you thinking about?" Elena smiled, remembering their conversation in the medical bay weeks ago. About silence and how much it costs when competent people choose to stay quiet. And about speaking up. About the responsibility that comes with knowledge. For 10 years, I told myself that hiding was safer, that invisibility was a fair price for security. Elena gestured toward the ship around them. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It just ensures that when crisis comes, the people with solutions aren't allowed to offer them. Rena was quiet for a moment and said, "I've been thinking about applying for the advanced engineering program, learning the kind of systems integration work you do." "You should. The Arctic needs engineers who understand that technology serves people, not the other way around." As they talked, Elena felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and identity fully embraced. She had spent a decade learning to be invisible, but she had finally remembered how to be seen. The Svalbard continued its journey through the ice, carrying its crew towards new missions and new challenges. In the reactor room far below, sophisticated systems hummed with the steady rhythm of properly integrated technology. On the bridge, decisions were made by officers who had learned to value competence over credentials. And in the Arctic waters ahead, endless possibilities stretched toward the horizon like an open sea. Elena Mirov stood at the observation deck rail, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, finally complete in the knowledge that she had chosen service over silence, courage over concealment, and that sometimes the person who makes your meals is indeed the person who saves your life. The wind carried the scent of snow and possibility, and Elena smiled as she watched the ice part before them, revealing the deep blue truth of the sea beneath.
Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.